Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Unlimited. Today, we are talking about loving ourselves through grief. This is a heavy time we are living through, and the holidays at any time can be very painful for anyone who has lost a loved one, particularly this year with so much loss of life and a collective grieving after everything that has happened in 2020. I felt like we needed to talk about grief in this episode in particular. Grief is a hard topic to explore, and there are so many different layers to it. It's also one that, while it's deeply personal, it's important to know that you are not alone as you walk through that experience. So, to support this conversation, I would love to introduce you to my dear friend and one of my favorite humans, Lisa Zawrotny. Lisa is the founder of Positively Productive Systems and the host of the Positively Living podcast. As a certified stress management and productivity coach, she shares the powerful healing of simplicity, self-care, and structure with multi-passionate entrepreneurs and multitasking caregivers. Lisa became a coach and speaker after a deeply overwhelming time in her own life, juggling multiple roles as a caregiver, wife, mother, and business owner. She is now on a mission to help her overwhelmed audience make space for what matters in their lives by teaching value-based decluttering and customized systems and habits design. Lisa holds certifications in stress and time management, life coaching, and meditation, and is a member of the American Institute of Stress and the National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals. Lisa and I have collaborated several times on her podcast, Positively Living, where she and I chatted about toxic positivity, on my YouTube channel, where she and I talked about gratitude and productivity. Lisa just opened a new membership group, the Positively Living membership community, which offers you a simple coaching solution that's accessible and affordable, where you'll receive access to exclusive content, including Q&As with special guests, workshops, coaching, and more. I will have links to all of Lisa's amazing resources in the show notes, along with the other places that you can hear our conversations. Lisa always brings such a depth, grace, and wisdom to any conversation, and I felt like she was the perfect first guest to have on my podcast, especially as we engage this heavy topic. In our conversation, we explore learning about ourselves in the mess, the difference between being organized and simplified and neat and tidy, different kinds of grief and ways we grieve, what intentionality around grief looks like, how to be supportive of someone's grieving process, and more. Grief has come up for a lot of my clients, from the loss of a loved one to loss of plans to experiencing the weight of the energy in the world right now. Wherever you are in your experience of grief during this time, I hope that you will find some comfort and support in this conversation. So without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Valerie Friedlander, Certified Life Business Alignment Coach, and this is Unlimited. This podcast bridges the individual and the societal, scientific and spiritual, positive and negative, nerdy and no, there's just a lot of nerdy. Come on board and let's unlock a life that's as badass as you are. Welcome, Lisa. I am so excited to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Valerie. It is my pleasure. I love chatting with you, and I'm excited to dig into a new topic with you again.
Lisa, would you please share a little bit in your own words about you?
I would be happy to, and I'll try to keep it brief so that we can explore this specific topic. But part of my story is actually also the reason why this is such an important topic to me and why it matters, why I've explored it myself. So for starters, hi, I'm Lisa. I am a wife and a mom of two kiddos who are now in middle school, and I don't know how that happened. I'm also a former caregiver, and that is part of the story that led me to be the coach that I am today. I was a caregiver for my mom who had Alzheimer's at the same time that I was pregnant with both my children and caring for them. And it was definitely a story of survival mode and having my own chaos and clutter just building on top of me in my life. It's hard even to this day, years later, to express just what I went through. And, there are so many levels of grief that I think about that I went through at the time and then later, and we'll definitely touch upon those as they relate to the story when we talk about this topic. But so that survival mode, it was a cue for me when I was released from it to say, what's next and how can I do it differently this time? It was like a second chance really for me to look at life differently. And that's where the simplifying came from. The decluttering came from the understanding that self-care is not optional. It's necessary, right? All of those things that you and I explore so much, it was right in front of me to make different choices. And as I did that and realized how healing it was, I started helping people simplify in a very traditional way as a professional organizer. And then I moved into productivity coaching and life coaching and stress management coaching because it's all connected. Mm-hmm. And that's what I do today. I hope that I can help people avoid some of what I went through. But at the very least, I know that sometimes life is simply going to happen. So what I can do is help them learn the skills and have the tools to navigate it better than I did. That's my hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I have appreciated about what you've shared and just the way you show up is a lot of embracing the growth in all experiences, the value in all experiences. And it's something that we've talked a lot about, and it's hard to do when you're in it. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. That's one of the things that I think is really important about recognizing that we are human. And part of it, that's a messy experience. And a lot of times we don't want to be messy. We want it all nice and neat and clean and organized.
Yeah, we do.
and it's just not. And if it was, it wouldn't have the meaning. Like when we think about meaningfulness, and I'm not really a big believer that there's outside meaning necessarily, but that we bring meaning to the experiences that happen to us. And it's just part of our nature to do that. I would be really curious to hear your thoughts on that idea of the process in being messy and the value in the mess, as someone whose business has been around making things neater.
I love that you asked that question. I think this is really interesting because I do think that we learn in the mess and that we grow in the mess. But I also think that the mess for us is something for us to learn more about ourselves. It's data. You and I love to collect the data and figure out what's going on. To me, the mess tells us something about what's going on. Sometimes it can tell us about maybe where we've veered off course, or we've changed something up, or we have, something called mission creep, right? Like we're like going completely off course from where we intended. Other times it's simply what's happening in life, and we have some choices as to how we respond. And so to me, it's not that I don't want to help you clean up the mess, but I think there's a difference between becoming organized and simplifying, which is what I focus on, versus this idea of being clean and neat and tidy. Marie Kondo's big on the tidy, and I by no means bash her. I actually appreciate what she's done to create awareness for the industry and how she's encouraged people to look at their lives and their spaces and talk about joy. So I love that aspect of it. But when you say tidying up to me, that means, let's just, clean up the mess a bit. And for me, it's more like I want to excavate it.
Yes. Yes, I love that. What it makes me think of is the word excavate is about understanding and observing and exploring. It resonates a lot with my whole idea of like putting on your science goggles, right? Like when you're looking at something, put on your science goggles so that you can productively assess what's going on instead of reactively assessing what's going on, and resonates with that idea of it's not about hiding the mess. It's not about the mess being bad per se, right? It's about acknowledging there's a reason there's a mess here and excavating it for wisdom within that lived experience.
And sometimes taking a look at it and coming to terms with it, managing your own expectations. That's a big part of what I coach, especially for mamas who are also running businesses where there's, a set of things that they want in their lives. And when they value, you and I talk about values so much that we need to understand what it is that we value, how we want to show up. And if you want to create this business and help other people and raise your children and be present for them and, have meals together and things like that, then having a, magazine ready home may not be an option. You know what I mean? And so managing those expectations, coming to terms with that, understanding that the mess is not the mess you thought it was because you were living in the shoulds or having certain desires or expectations for yourself, whatever it happens to be. I mean, you're allowed to want a beautiful home, but when you are working on your priorities, sometimes you realize in certain cases, I think we've especially seen this year with so many big changes. It's like, well, something's got to give. So what's the thing that's going to give based on your value list, right?
I love that, recognizing that you want to build your life off of conscious chosen values versus on reactive expectations. The subliminal messaging that we get from looking at the magazines and watching the reality TV and all the judgment of what's desirable and what's not desirable. Like I particularly appreciated in your episode on grief with Katie Ressler talking about menstruation. Yes. And how like all the products that are advertised on TV use blue stuff and not red stuff, as though it's like, we don't actually want to talk about that. It actually turns me off because I'm like, no, why is this undesirable? That feels devaluing, which is contrary to living in your values.
That's right. Yeah, that was a great point that Katie made. She was talking about how we're being presented with these expectations, if you will, and then we're taking them on for ourselves, that life can't possibly be difficult and hard and painful. And we can't, don't show your weaknesses. Don't show that you're bleeding, none of that. And so when she actually defined grief in that, it's things not going as expected, so to speak, bringing in those expectations idea. And I think of it as, experiencing a loss, but I loved her spin on that it's like, okay, you had certain expectations and now it didn't go that way. So I love the idea that we need to back up a little bit and be like, okay, what were the expectations?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the idea that showing feelings and that having feelings and being open about messiness in life is somehow makes you not as good, like that you're somehow less than to have that. And I feel like there's been a backlash to that of like, let me show you all of my dirty laundry.
Yeah.
Well,
okay, so the pendulum swung hard there.
Acknowledge that there is laundry and not necessarily like show the dirty panties, like
we don't need to see all the things.
See all the laundry. Yeah. Or, to share it in a way that is intentional. Again, I find that reactivity can go multiple ways. We can be reactive to diving into, I don't want to be that, as much as we can. I do want to be that.
Yeah.
I want to explore a little bit because given this time, there's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of layers of grief happening. There are people who are grieving loved ones. A lot of people right now grieving loved ones.
Yeah.
And energetically, for those of us who are sensitive to the energies around us, are feeling that, even if we're not directly experiencing that. I will work with a lot of empaths, and they're like, why am I so tired? I feel this heaviness. I'm like, well, there's a reason. As much as we don't want to look at it, as much as the headlines aren't talking about it, we've lost over 300,000 people.
Yeah.
That's heavy. That's really heavy. So whether you've been directly impacted or not, if you're sensitive to what's happening, you're feeling that. Not to mention people making choices to not do the things that they're used to doing. We've chosen to stay home and not go visit family, and finding ways to connect with that space. Like, we're going to order Chinese food because we always order Chinese food on Christmas Eve. We always go to a Chinese restaurant together. We can't do that, but so we're all going to order Chinese food and Zoom, but finding ways to connect. There's still this sadness and grief involved with that. So there's so many layers. I would love for you to share a little bit about excavating grief, what that looks like in a time like this, maybe normally when one is experiencing and remembering the loss of someone loved that is no longer here, but also in a bigger sense of we're all in that space to some level at this point.
So let's back up a little bit and start with this idea of grief, right? And this idea that it's a response, a natural response, by the way, to a loss. Now, this could be the loss of a loved one. It could be the loss as in death of someone. And I mean, that can happen. We can feel this deeply when a celebrity passes away. And what you're talking about in terms of what we're all experiencing, whether it's for the loss of this group of people that have passed away due to COVID, this is what's called collective grief. And I really need to bring up stress at the same time. And I know you talk about this all the time as well. So you're right there with me, that we are experiencing a stress response and we are trying to process these emotions and these experiences. And so when you think about the losses that we're all going through in general in life, and then when you add a pandemic on top of it. Okay. So loss of potentially family members or close friends. You have the loss of people as a whole in our society. So there's that collective kind of grief. There's so many different kinds of grief too. Anticipatory grief. What's coming next? I actually had that with my mom because Alzheimer's takes away cognitive function. And so I was losing bits of her, and I was also anticipating, well, what's coming next? What is she going to forget next? When, is this finally going to take her? That sort of thing. Let me see. There's traumatic grief. Okay. So when you add the trauma to it, and we are all going through trauma together right now. I mean, there's just so many levels of it. Where should we go with this? I don't even know. But the point is, I think the first step is acknowledging this, that we're processing this. And as you said too, whenever we can in life, it's so important that it's not simply reactive, that we're intentional about what we do. But in this particular case, grieving is a natural response that I think we need to honor and let happen. And one of the best ways we can do that is by exactly what we're doing today, having a conversation about it, acknowledging it. So that's just the starting point of so many different kinds of grief and what we're dealing with. What would you like me to, where would you like me to go with that next?
Just keep talking. It makes me think about how saying it out loud, as hard as it is sometimes, because when you say things out loud, it's like you're making them real.
Yeah.
Even when they're already real, it's kind of like it's another level of real when you acknowledge it in words and you say certain things. And I've often heard people say stuff around like the idea of manifesting. Oh, I don't want to manifest something by talking about it. It's like, well, I mean, I get the sense of that, but it's not the same thing. And in this case, that applies mostly to anticipatory grief, right? But like,
yes, agreed.
Actual present grief, talking about it makes it real, but I think it also allows you to be with it, almost like it's something to hold, right? Like I'm not sure I'm going to articulate this well, because a lot of times with the big emotions, I find it's experiential. It's kind of like it's there, but not, words don't do justice. So I find it's very difficult, which is why I wanted to have a conversation with you about it, because I'm like, ugh.
No, it makes sense, because a lot of what we're going through is ineffable. And I think what we're talking about instead is not to describe what we're going through, but to say we need to go through it. We need to talk it out as best we can. And to me personally, I think that talking it out, of course, I'm a coach, so I'm biased. What can I tell you? But I really believe that when we talk it out, like you said, not in the manifesting anticipatory kind of way of like, I'm calling this to me, but rather when we're putting it out there, I feel like it takes away that power that paralyzes us. That's what I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And it is, I love that you used the word ineffable. But I feel like it's acknowledging rather than trying to control it.
Yes.
And recognizing that it's messy to talk about it too. Like it's hard and it's messy, and it's okay that it's hard and messy to talk about. But the process of stating it makes a difference in terms of your walking through it. One of the things that I've heard you talk about was making intentional time and space to grieve, and recognizing that there's a coping that goes into that. And it's not just about being neat and organized. And I think sometimes when we think about being intentional, we think about like everything is planned and neat and organized. Mm-hmm. And intentionality, I see as being different than that. It's about choice in engaging, and not necessarily controlling what that engagement looks like, but saying, I am going to give space to engaging this.
I love that you used give space, because when I coach this and we're talking from the productivity standpoint, and you're like, okay, so how do you, control or time or, schedule this? I'm like, well, you don't necessarily. However, you allow space for it. And sometimes you can do that in certain ways. For example, anticipating in a different way, that's not the anticipatory grief, but rather anticipating that there will be a certain anniversary or a certain experience that could bring about more emotions and more responses and unexpected things. Sort of, it's a little of the expect the unexpected, but in a way to understand that you need the space to process. And if you don't, well, then fine. Then you had some extra space, extra time. Nothing wrong with that. A basic example, a very traditional example, if you will, is if you lose someone on a certain date. Okay. And then that date comes up. Don't schedule yourself with all kinds of things where you need a lot of brain power, or, you know what I mean? Like, allow yourself that room when anniversaries come up. In this case, what you're talking about with how we have to change so much of our holidays, give yourself the room. That's where simplifying comes in, not over planning, overbooking, keeping some space, maybe even the space of giving yourself some time alone, and maybe having a conversation with your family. If you're, together, in the home, and saying, I'm going to take 15 minutes even. It doesn't matter how much. The point is, it's that space. It's creating that time and that place where you can let yourself feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It reminds me, I appreciate how you brought up stress response and how people have different ways of processing stress and grief. And I talk about that in my stress episode, where it's recognizing what ways you tend towards when you're processing, and knowing that there are stages to that. Like there's your natural go-to when you're processing, and it may be an avoidance kind of thing. Like, I need to do something fun that I'm going to have a lot of emotional charge. So thinking about things cognitively might not be the best space for me, but like, I want to go do something playful to connect with other people because I can't connect with the person who I miss. And so I'm going to honor their life by connecting with someone else or doing an activity that reminds me of them, that says, you're present for me because you've impacted me. And then with missing people, how my family, we're going to do certain activities that we always do, even though we're going to do them far apart. We're getting creative with how we're going to do them, even though there's going to be sadness in doing them because we're not doing them together. And so allowing that space to think creatively, knowing that you won't be able to think creatively when it comes up, to plan ahead for the space that we may need.
Exactly. And that's a good kind of anticipating, because it's, in life in general, I coach this all the time. And you know this, when you're looking at your calendar, when you're making appointments, when you're living your life, the more a buffer that you can create. And if you think even in the simplest way, okay, I have an appointment and I need to get there and it takes this amount of time, but I need to budget longer than that because I'm going to get everything and walk out of the house and forget my phone, ask me how I know, and then get in the car, then there's going to be traffic or some other delay, that who could even anticipate that. But if you get in the practice of building in that buffer, then when these delays inevitably happen, it doesn't impact you quite as hard. And I'm not saying that may be the same for grief, but when you allow space to process something, I'll tell you right now that it may not be easier to have the space to process it. But when you have to go to an appointment or do something that requires thinking or be a responsible adult and you are in the middle of an intense grief response, I promise you it'll be harder. So that's the idea of creating that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense that knowing or being present to that it can come up any time. Like grief, you say in that episode about like, it's not linear. It's not organized. You can't organize grief, but you can acknowledge that it is present. I mean, I lost my grandmother years ago, 2014, and it still hits me at random times, just the absence of her presence in my life, or like times where I just want to call her and ask for her thoughts or tell her something, and it'll just come up. And I can't really plan for that, but I can give myself grace for that and acknowledge that she is still with me because she meant so much to me that she would come up for me.
Yeah.
And I wonder, recognizing that it's not a linear thing and that it's not a time-oriented thing. Like when you talk about processing it, it's not about moving on from it. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about what it means when you say processing. Like, what does processing look like when it comes to grief?
Okay. Processing can be, I think, in part understanding, I'm hurting right now. It's acknowledging the hurt. Sometimes it can look like tears, and that's one that you'd pick up on quickly, but it can also be anger and outbursts and frustration. It can be, and again, that's why I say there's such similarities to stress responses, because grief is impacting us in a similar way. When our hormones are surging through us and we have stress hormones going, how's it going to come out? Well, it's going to depend. So processing it, I think, has more to do with letting it flow through you, acknowledging it. And the one thing that I want to mention, and this is something that you had said to me, even in just talking about this conversation that we would have, is this idea of hope that comes into play. And something that came to me, and I do want to mention a book. I mentioned it also in the grief episode as well, but on grief and grieving, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she also did a book called On Death and Dying as well. And what just blows me away by this woman is that, she wrote these things for us as she was dying herself. And she brings so much, including the stages of grief that we talk about. And, I think this idea that was my takeaway from reading what she wrote is that every time I process grief, if you will, every time I go through it in whatever capacity, picking up something and remembering and feeling that heartache or that pain or crying or, experiencing whatever emotion it is that I have, it's healing. And it's not that we're moving on, we're moving through maybe if it, and again, goes back to how difficult this is to explain. Everyone's timeline will be different. How they move through it will be different. People are sometimes surprised at where I am in my process of grieving with what I've experienced. We're all different. So understanding that too is very important. I think it has more to do with letting it flow through you and accepting it. That's what processing means. But the one thing that I want to encourage you with is that as you do, there is a healing element to it. It's not that it'll necessarily go away or fade, but I think you become stronger. I think it's part of what builds resilience. It's not that life is no longer hard. It's not that we no longer miss someone as much or that we no longer miss whatever loss that we felt as much, but rather that we are stronger at managing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I almost see it as a assimilation of the experience
Yes.
and of the person. Like the less time you think about that person doesn't mean that they're any less part of who you are. Everyone is part of who we are becomes like at a deeper level, right? Like it's not as present in the frontal cortex part of our brain. It's more in an essential part of our being.
Like shifting from short-term to long-term memory, right?
Yeah. I feel like allowing space for grieving and for processing emotions and being with them is like, it's a self-care. It's a way of loving yourself through that. And that's powerful to love yourself in that kind of way.
Yeah. And I have to add that, and this is something that I've thought of quite a bit as a mom, is that I'm not only caring for myself because there's that, I like that your term of assimilation, all the things that's the processing, all the things that are happening as you are acknowledging the hurt and the pain, but doing it openly, honoring myself as opposed to feeling shame that I can't get over this or, how cruel would that be? I would never do that to someone else. Why would I do it to myself? So there's that part. And then on top of it, I am modeling for my children what it means to grieve and the fact that even to this day, I will shed tears for my family that I've lost. I've lost both parents at this point. And it's tricky because, for example, I lost my mom on Christmas. And so that day has a mix of emotions for me. I have so much joy and my family and, my husband and my children, my in-laws, we have such a beautiful day together. But in the evening, at the time that my mom passed, I pause and I acknowledge that. And I know that's coming. So I've built that in, you know what I mean? I know it's going to be that mix, but I hope that also encourages listeners because they coexist, the joy and the pain. One does not negate the other.
Yeah. It's being human.
Yeah.
And there's a fullness in being human that is often uncomfortable. And our society really likes to only emphasize the value behind the happy. Well, let's be happy.
Yeah, that was the episode you and I did, episode 8, by the way. Amazing, because it's all about, let's stay positive. How about let's break down? I'll hand you some tissues and we're just gonna feel the feels and understand that we can be a hot mess. And it's not only okay, it's encouraged because it's going to do so much for us.
Yeah. And knowing that looks different for different people.
That's right.
You mentioned being a mom, and that was one of the hard things for me as a mom, the way my kids process stress is very different than the way I process stress.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm all, come cry and let me hold you. And they're all like, I am going to go do all the things I am not supposed to do and get energy from you in that way. I'm like, could I give you the snuggly energy instead of the like energy that you seem to be going for? Like,
Could I do snuggles instead of a trampoline? Would that be okay?
yeah. One of the other things that you mentioned, though, that I think as we wrap up, I would love to touch on that idea of joy and gratitude for that person or the people in our life or the experience of living and being alive. And, you and I have had lots of conversations around gratitude, and you have a whole Facebook group on gratitude. So I would love for you to share a little bit about how gratitude plays together with grief and their relationship.
Yeah, I'd love to, because this was one of the discoveries that I made when I was first exploring gratitude for myself as a healing habit, and then doing more and more research so that I could better coach it. This concept that I read was this idea that you can be devastated and grateful at the same time. And I was just like, whew, that's powerful. And it reminds us of what gratitude is and what it isn't. I think we mistake gratitude for being this emotion of, it goes into that toxic positivity idea, right? Of the happy and gratitude. And I'm grateful and yay. And we do want to celebrate. We do want to rejoice in what the world has to offer. But gratitude is a deeper form of appreciation. And sometimes it's the searching and the acknowledging within the hurt. So the way that I see grief and gratitude working together is you have the pain and you are processing things. And maybe in the moment, I actually call this gratitude in adversity. It's part of how it plays in life, right? So this could be trauma. It could be grief. It could be really any struggles that we're going through. Is that at first blush, it may seem like gratitude's difficult to practice at that point because you're hurting. And I get that, but that's actually when you need it the most. And so what you're doing in that moment, gratitude is really more of a seeking. You're looking, I call them like when you have a fire that's almost gone out and you look for the embers and you kind of stoke them to rebuild that flame. So in a moment of hurting, we can be grateful for the love that we had with someone that we've lost, or we can be grateful for the experiences or the people that came to us with a job we no longer have, or, with an opportunity that isn't there. And sometimes we grieve things that it was our choice, so it's complicated. But in each of these moments and whatever we're experiencing, sometimes it can be gratitude, appreciation for having that time and space to process it, having people who allow us, who just hold space for us and say, go ahead, for understanding, for, so many different things. But really, I see it as a seeking out of the things that you want to focus on to help heal you, not to negate what's happening or negate the pain, but rather to support it, because positive psychology research is backing this up, that it is healing and it is connecting and it is transforming. So wherever we can bring gratitude in, it helps elevate us in this process.
Yeah, I think that's so important to remember, especially if you're supporting somebody who's grieving.
Yeah.
I recently had a conversation that was talking about the difference between concern and care. I feel like concern is more about me and my feelings, and care is focusing on that person and saying, what do you need?
Yes.
How can I be there for you? And instead of imposing my beliefs of what you need upon you, it's that holding space. And sometimes there isn't anything to do other than hold space, which is where I appreciate the concept of holding someone in the light, which is what I came to from Quaker practices. I will hold you in the light. For me, imagining light around that person and holding them in that, or like a snuggly blanket or a warm fuzzy or whatever, but like holding that energy and being ready to show up when asked to show up
Mhm.
instead of force helping someone in a way that actually doesn't allow for them to have that space to heal.
That's right. And one of the things that you're doing when it feels like you're doing nothing, remember that what you are doing is just not as tangible as you might want it to be. But you have to let go of that when you're trying to help. Holding space like that, what you're doing is you're honoring their need to process it in their own way. And instead of, that, like you said, the concern, which again, it's not that it comes from a bad place or anything. I mean, everything can come from a place of wanting someone to be better. But I can remember, Katie and I talk about this too, both of us have experienced a culture where it's like, okay, dry your tears, don't cry anymore. Okay, stop. Because the person saying that, I mean, they don't want you to hurt, but also they're not comfortable with letting you hurt. And if you can come from this perspective of, okay, this is really hard to watch this person I care about hurting, but I know that by them letting that flow through them, they're going to heal from it. I'm not saying fully, but in that moment, there is healing happening. And they're getting to do it in their own way and not feel shame or, anything else that keeps them from simply feeling. That's a beautiful gift that you're giving them by doing that.
Yeah. What an opportunity to also sit with your own discomfort and what that brings up for you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always fun. I'm so glad that you were available to show up with me for this conversation. There's so much more to explore, and unfortunately we don't have time, but lots of great stuff in the show notes. Definitely be sure to check that out. Before we close, Lisa, I've got a couple questions that you're the first to get them. And I would love for you to share, what does it mean to you to be unlimited?
It means possibility, and like endless possibility, that there's always an option around the bend. There's always something to look forward to. And it comes back to that word that I mentioned before, that you and I have mentioned repeatedly, that I want everybody to leave with today, is hope.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. And then finally, when you want to feel unlimited, what song would you listen to?
Oh, this is an easy one. Comes immediately to me from the soundtrack, The Greatest Showman, A Million Dreams. You probably knew this. You probably could have guessed it. Yeah, A Million Dreams. I mean, it's about dreaming, about possibilities, about hope, and just, being unlimited.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for joining me today. I appreciate you always. And everyone listening, I appreciate you for being here, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Thanks for listening. I so appreciate you being here. If you got something out of today's episode, please share it. Leave me a review, take a screenshot, and post it on social with a shout out to me. Send it to a friend, or, all of the above. Want to hang out more? Join me on Instagram. Or better yet, get on my mailing list to make sure you don't miss out on anything. And remember, your possibilities are as unlimited as you are. Allow yourself to shine, my friend. The world needs your light. See you next time.